everyone in the UFO community is faced with a seemingly outrageous challenge to try to make sense out of the enormity of material that there is to study. How do you effectively navigate a course through an incredible body of material that encompasses many different ancient civilizations that have megalithic architecture, giant stones? How do you bring in the element of secret societies and the occult ceremonies that are taking place within these societies? What is the relationship between those secret societies and the governance of our modern world at the elite level? Is there a deep state? Is there some sort of supranational cult that is actually controlling the world? And then, how does this knowledge gel with the concept of a spontaneous quantum leap in human evolution that could be coming our way? It's obviously a lot to take in. It's a lot to process the scope of the material that's available. But in order to unpack this, I'd like to try to go through a little bit of what I feel to be the summary of how all these pieces fit together. A good starting point for this esoteric investigation is to rethink everything that we thought we knew about history. To understand that history is written by the victors. For example, if the Germans had won World War II, then the American bombing of Dresden, which was an artistic commune of no statistical or defense significance to the United States' interests, they simply blew up a whole city of hippies, basically, in World War II. That would be seen as one of the great atrocities. The dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, again, would have been seen as a war crime. And the Germans would have become the dominant force on Earth. Probably all the stuff with the concentration camps would have been covered up, and we'd have a very different world. So I use that as a theoretical example to show that this does happen. We actually do have a very bloodthirsty satanic cult that has been running the world for millennia, and their crimes are largely being concealed. So let's go back now to ancient Rome, and let's delve into a very unfortunate chapter in history, which was that Rome was at war with another nation called Carthage. Carthage at the time was openly professing their allegiance to satanic gods, such as Moloch and Baal. And when you look at the history of what was taking place, you have babies literally being burned alive in front of statues to these gods. This was an open element of society. So you have to understand that when the Romans actually defeated Carthage, what they discovered was that even though Carthage lost the Punic Wars, they had discovered, if you will, a technology that works. In other words, these gods, quote unquote, were in fact real extraterrestrial beings. Baal and Moloch, as bloodthirsty as they appeared to be, did exist, and they had what for us would just be an example of higher technology, but for the people of the time would be indistinguishable from magic. If you have a UFO or a craft that can control gravity, then it would make sense that you would have the ability to direct gravitational energy as needed. Therefore, if you have an invading armada and a particular extraterrestrial race is seeking to defend that territory, let's say there's a marine invasion taking place, you could, for example, direct a gravitational beam into the ocean in the area where that armada of ships are invading, and then cause such disruption in the sea that the ships themselves all completely sink in what appears to be a vicious storm. No one is aware that that's actually the result of a technology being used. Yet, if we had the ability to control gravity, it would be very easy to see how you could make the oceans churn, and it would be inevitable that all those ships would sink. So this is what actually happened. Rome developed an open relationship with these satanic gods, and actually completely sink in what appears to be a vicious storm. No one is aware that that's actually the result of a technology being used. Yet, if we had the ability to control gravity, it would be very easy to see how you could make the oceans churn, and it would be inevitable that all those ships would sink. So this is what actually happened. Rome developed an open relationship with these satanic gods and actually took that information and weaponized it for their own imperial aspirations. Another very important element to this is to understand that Rome not only invaded and conquered Carthage, they invaded and conquered Egypt. And with that came the assimilation of the Egyptian priesthood. When you look at the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, what you find is that they have disturbingly elongated skulls, which seems to be the original inspiration for the H.R. Geiger alien illustrations, almost like a banana coming off the back of the head. So you can go back to, for example, some of the illustrations of the first Egyptian pharaoh, Osiris, and see, sure enough, he has weird green skin, and he has an elongated skull. The point in the Egyptian dynastic bloodline where you really see this clearly is with Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and then there is also continuation of these elongated skulls with their children, such as in particular Meritata. Now, you can look at certain sculptures of Akhenaten, and you can see that he has a very strange elongated skull, and in fact, in one of them he's wearing a hat that has a brim that actually looks like the edge of a UFO. And this very well could be that they were coming in to Earth in these flying saucers, which could explain why the Egyptians had such a prevalence of the symbolism of the winged disc. Conventional Egyptologists say that's the sun moving through space, but could it be something more than that? It's a very good question. And we also hear that the Egyptians referred back to a time called Zep Tepi, or first time, which is before Osiris. And that during that time, there were these different types of humanoids that had, for example, avian features on their face, such as Horus. Or, in the case of Thoth, it's a similar type of bird, but in this case it's been described as an ibis. It's very interesting to note that Corey Goode was contacted by an extraterrestrial group that also had avian faces with a humanoid type of body. And it was only after we've been doing this for well over a year, maybe even 2 years, that William Henry noted that the original frescoes of Horus portrayed him as having blue skin. And therefore, there are examples of blue avians. It's also interesting to note that in the Japanese literature, they have the Tengu, or the birdmen of the mountains. And once again, you have a human body with a distinctly avian face, including that there's actually a beak for a mouth, but that they are described and drawn as being blue, and that they have feathers on their bodies. So this is a very curious thing. Did we find these beings? Look again to the story of the foundation of Islam and what happens with Muhammad. Now, Muhammad claims that he was contacted by what we would call an extraterrestrial, that he described as Archangel Gabriel. Archangel Gabriel in the original writings is consistently referred to as a humanoid being with bird-like features. So once again, now you have the whole foundation of Islam there, always fitting into a particular narrative of avian humanoids. So even going back this far in history, it appears that there was an avian type of race that was benevolent and had our best interest in mind, and then you have an elite race with elongated skulls, which in the fullness of our research does not appear to have our best in mind. So even going back this far in history, it appears that there was an avian type of race that was benevolent and had our best interest in mind, and then you have an elite race with elongated skulls, which in the fullness of our research does not appear to have our best interests in mind. The elongated skull physiology has been found all over the planet. We see it in Wilcock, South Africa, where a whole series of these skeletons were dug up, where they have freakishly elongated skulls. This is in the early 1900s, and is why they're called Wilcock skulls. We see the same type of remains being dug up in a dig in Siberia, in a town called Omsk, where the miners that found this were so scared by the unusual physiology of the skulls that they cried and they left the job. We also see reports that the Mongolians, the Huns, as they were conquering and going west, had these strange skull features as well. We see African cultures that had these skull physiologies, and in fact, to modern day, certain tribes in Africa still have unusual elongated skulls. We actually see these skulls in the tombs of the elite in Europe, and this becomes a very important element of how the modern day Illuminati or deep state or cabal actually believes that they are the remnant of these people with elongated skulls. And then, interestingly enough, you have a different strain in the Americas. When you look at Mesoamerica, there are extensive figurines that have been carved and wall frescoes that were carved showing people that are in a priestly role with elongated skulls that are distinctly not the same as the skulls of everyone else. When you look at the Mesoamerican region, there are many, many examples of these skulls being dug up. They're on display in Bolivia and various other places in Peru, and they are dug up next to many of these megalithic architecture sites. So clearly these people were there. We can look at the cranial sutures on these skulls, and what you find out is that there are distinctive differences between a normal human skull, which has what's called the sagittal suture, the suture that goes directly across the top of the head here. When you look at the elongated skull physiology, they don't have that. There's one bony plate on the top that doesn't have a sagittal suture. And that's just one of a series of things. If you actually look at the area underneath the skull that we have, if you tilt the skull upside down, there are these certain inlets that we have for where the nerve fibers go into the brain. And they are distinctly different in their positioning with the people with elongated skulls versus ours, as well as the actual center of gravity balance point for where the spine merges with the skull. In order to balance this elongated skull, that position has to change. What's interesting, though, is that from the face perspective, these facial features would appear indistinguishable from ours. That's why, when you look at images of Nefertiti or Akhenaten or the statues of their daughter, let's just stop for a second and look at Meritaten, because Meritaten was fairly vain and had a number of really accurate renditions of her face and skull done in sculpture. And these are on display, many of them are on display at the Berlin National Museum in Germany. With Meritaten, you clearly see that she is completely bald. She has a freakishly elongated skull, but her face appears like a normal human being. It is common for historians to say that this is the result of an artistic interpretation. And yet, why in the world would you allow someone to turn you into a monster and not have that person killed? Why would you allow someone to make your skull look so weird and elongated? Why would you shave your head if you didn't have to? I find it interesting that we have this evidence hidden out in the open, and we see the elongated skulls worldwide, but we don't ask the deeper questions. Thanks to the insider testimony of Corey Good, we have now discovered that the people with the elongated skulls are survivors of a catastrophe that took place in our solar system. They evolved on a super Earth, which was similar in the climate as what we have. And at that time, they had a much smaller moon that also was watery and habitable like the Earth, and that was Mars. The history that has been suppressed from us includes the idea that 500,000 years ago, these two civilizations were at war. And there was a decisive event in that war where they blew up the main super Earth. entire solar system. Fragments of that exploded planet shot through the Martian atmosphere and caused all of the atmosphere to burn off, which caused the oceans to burn off. The planet itself exploded into a series of fragments that became the asteroid belt. The oceans of that planet immediately froze and became the comets. And this is why Dr. Tom Van Flandern has his exploded planet hypothesis, where he looked at the asteroid belt and ran the numbers backwards and concluded that this was actually originally a planet that turned into asteroids. It was a great atrocity that took place. And I heard about it in secret programs that did much more research than Tom Van Flandern, where they called it the code name Brilliant Pebbles. And one of the fascinating things when I first met Corey Good was that he knew what the code name Brilliant Pebbles meant without me having to tell him. I had already written it up, and I already have recordings of people telling me. That was one of many fascinating connections. The idea, in terms of our cosmic history, is that when these two worlds were destroyed, they did not all die. There was, in fact, a large population that had built itself into Earth's moon. Now, when you look at Earth's moon, there is extensive evidence that it's hollow on the inside, and I've heard from several different insiders that there are actually up to 10,000 floors, 10,000 decks inside the moon, where each one is like a certain story in a hotel, if you will, but it's vast in terms of how far the square footage goes. This was apparently built through the use of nanite microtechnology, where the nanites go in and they send them back into the past, and then they build out a whole entire habitable civilization inside a given moon or asteroid. So the architecture inside the moon is apparently something that was used to help salvage a planet. If there was some kind of catastrophe coming their way, they can move everyone inside this moon and keep them safe if the planet was going to be destroyed or otherwise damaged, and then migrate from one place to another. These moons also were built with weapon systems as a form of defense, so that if someone tried to attack, like pirates, that planet, the planet of people inside, that they could be fended off. So the cosmic history apparently is that Earth's moon, or others in our solar system like it, were used as a Death Star. George Lucas in Star Wars was operating apparently on real information that was kept secret in these elite bloodlines regarding the idea that Earth's moon and others like it do have weapon systems in them that are powerful enough to destroy entire worlds. And this is how the asteroid belt was first created. It was through the use of a Death Star type of moon. It's important to note that this civilization that encompassed Mars and the super Earth very likely had a much larger population than what we have on Earth now. They did have the ability to travel throughout our solar system and beyond, and so they had many, many outposts in our solar system and even possibly outside our solar system as well. When their main homeworlds were destroyed, they still had a large population inside the moon. And again, there's 10,000 floors in certain places for them to live, so they lived comfortably in the moon. Ultimately, what takes place is that the moon allowed them to continue to survive, but due to the reduced gravity of the moon, obviously it's much smaller in size than the super Earth was, they lose their height. So the original civilization that lived on the super Earth, probably based on what we've seen and heard, was 70 feet tall. They were real giants, amazingly tall people. And the historical records on Earth of the Titans would be where these people at some points actually visited Earth. There are apparently surviving records from ancient Greece of an archaeological expedition where they did find a 70-foot tall human skeleton. They dug it out of the ground, and it was a person, but a 70-foot tall person. All of that historical evidence has been lost, very likely removed from the planet by other extraterrestrial groups, so as not to interfere with our history too much. As you get to the time where these people survived inside the moon, their height now reduces, probably to the range of 25 feet in height, based on various things I've heard. There are definite historical records of giant skeletons being found on Earth in the 25 to 30 foot tall range. Now, it's interesting to note that these people, the survivors of this super Earth, were at war with another race of extraterrestrials that had a reptilian appearance. So the war between, if you will, the people of the progenitor race, as it's often called, and the people of this reptilian race is extensively documented in various historical records, including the ancient Hindu Vedas, where they actually have a group called Rakshasas, colloquially referred to as snakes. But these are snakes that have names, and snakes that appear to be like people. They are clearly at war, and they clearly have a humanoid appearance. There also was a benevolent group of these reptilians in the Hindu times that broke away and were positive and helped humanity, and they became known as the Nagas. To this day, you see Naga temples in India, where you have what looks like a human being from the top up, but then from the waist down, it's a snake. No, I'm not saying that they literally had snake bodies. They appear to have had 2 legs and 2 arms like us, but they had a distinctively disturbing look, where they have vertical slit pupils, their eyes are going to be the color of gold or red, they have scales visible on their face, they have pointy teeth, their nose and mouth actually projects out from the face more than ours does. They have claws on their hands and feet. They typically do not wear clothes. And they also would be, the tallest ones are 12 to 14 feet in height. So this would be a very disturbing thing to come up against. And these beings, these reptilians, were at war with the survivors of the catastrophe in our solar system. The survivors of the catastrophe that were in Earth's moon then suffered another massive cataclysm 55,000 years ago, which we now know was a solar flash, a massive emission of light, energy, and matter from the sun. Part of the problem when you have these solar flashes is that in addition to an enormous heating of the atmospheres and even the surface of planets that could be up to 1,000 degrees Celsius, we're literally talking about something that melts stone. You also have the sun throwing off a whole lot of debris, a whole lot of chunky, molten material that will physically strike the surface of planets and moons. This catastrophe apparently took place 55,000 years ago, and the people who were living in the moon felt that the degree of damage that was going to happen to the moon was so high that it was unlikely they would survive. So what they apparently did is to navigate the moon in front of the Earth, because the moon could be driven like a car. Now, by this point in history, the progenitors were well aware that our sun and other stars like it has a regularly repeating catastrophe every 25,000 years. This solar flash is what now is being called a micronova. A supernova is where a star completely explodes and nothing is left except for a red dwarf or brown dwarf, whereas the micronova causes an incredible flash to occur, but the star maintains its stability and its structure in the aftermath. And the latest NASA research that's only come out in the last year proves that there are multiple documented examples of micronovas everywhere we look. This is not uncommon. Stars do this naturally, and it is a very normal aspect of a given solar system. The degree of catastrophe for this particular solar flash 55,000 years ago was determined to be a lot higher than it normally would be by this progenitor race. Therefore, they knew that the damage would be very extensive. Could you save the Earth from devastation by putting the moon in front of it when there's a solar flash? No. We know that the shadow of a solar eclipse on the surface of the Earth certainly does not cover the full surface. It only covers an area of the surface. However, it was deemed that this was the only possibility to reduce the amount of damage to the Earth by having the moon take some of the impact. It would appear, based on the historical records, that the people living inside the moon did not know that this solar flash was going to happen. This was being kept secret from them because, based on the bodies that have been found inside the moon, there were approximately 20 billion people living inside the moon at this time. So it was a massive population. And I once had an insider who we call Bruce, who described that his faction of the military-industrial complex was only able to go inside the moon in these inner passageways a total of 6 times. But these were covert missions that they sent people in through, and they found a vast amount of control systems where you walk into the room and all the lights come on, and you have these big giant screens that are very wide, that have displays on them, and there's a control surface in front of it, and it was gorgeous. And it goes on for miles and miles and miles. And everywhere you look, there are these bodies that have not been cleaned up because the amount of square footage inside the moon is so vast, and the amount of depth was so vast, that huge regions inside the moon have never been cleaned up. They've never been explored. There is a stench in there from the dead bodies still. And so only portions of the moon have actually been reoccupied by various extraterrestrial races who have claimed certain parts of that real estate. Now, when the moon was hit by this solar flash, a small amount of that civilization, only the elite caste, chose to flee to the Earth. And they had to do it rather suddenly because they didn't want to be suspected of basically killing everyone by steering the moon in front of the Earth before the solar flash. We don't know exactly how many ships got out from the moon 55,000 years ago as this catastrophe took place, but we do have quite certain information that at least one very large mothership escaped. And by very large, we're talking 1 to 3 miles in diameter. This apparently was predominantly circular in shape, possibly teardrop shaped, and interestingly enough, they made it to Antarctica, what we now call Antarctica. This opens up another huge the moon in front of the Earth before the solar flash. We don't know exactly how many ships got out from the moon 55,000 years ago as this catastrophe took place, but we do have quite certain information that at least one very large mothership escaped. And by very large, we're talking 1 to 3 miles in diameter. This apparently was predominantly circular in shape, possibly teardrop shaped, and interestingly enough, they made it to Antarctica, what we now call Antarctica. This opens up another huge category of information, which is what has been referred to as the ancient builder race. When we look at the cosmic history of our solar system, we find that there is a civilization that occurred over 2 billion years ago. Now, the chronological measuring system they used in the secret space program to determine the age is clearly not carbon-14 radiation. This is some sort of advanced chronometric system that's with a technology probably derived from extraterrestrials vastly in excess of what we possess in the open world. However, there is quite some certainty that this civilization is over 2 billion years old. And then you have to ask yourself, what in the world could have survived for 2 billion years? Well, it's very fascinating because throughout our solar system, we have what has been referred to by various insiders I've spoken to as a cosmic junkyard. What is the junkyard? It is a collection of crystalline ruins. These ruins are made of a glass-like material. It could be clear glass. It could be tinted glass of different colors. Or in some cases, it is either brown or even black. And the material is not glass. It is actually a transparent aluminum. And there have already been alloys of transparent aluminum made by various companies now. And when they stress test these alloys, they find out it's 5 times stronger than bulletproof glass. Now think about this for a minute. If you could take transparent aluminum and build a dome of it over the surface of a moon, you would have something that would be resilient against micrometeorite strikes, thus providing a similar type of protection as a planet with an atmosphere. But now you can build a dome on a moon that's otherwise barren. It's subject to solar radiation. It's subject to meteors, micrometeorite hits. You can pressurize the inside of the dome, and now you have trees, you have grass, you have prairies and pastures, you have rivers, you have lakes, you could even have something like an ocean, and you could have buildings and a whole civilization of people that could live as if they were on a planet, but they're on an otherwise barren moon. Another very central aspect of their architecture was pyramids and obelisks. So believe it or not, pyramids and obelisks have been found on the moon, on Mars, and on other moons and satellites throughout our solar system that are very damaged and very, very old, over 2 billion years old. As our secret space program has apparently gone beyond our solar system with reverse engineered technology similar to what they got in the Roswell crash, which is over 70 years ago now, they found that all of the approximately 54 different stars in our own local group of stars are all gravitationally connected. Every one of those stars has planets and moons and satellites with these same crystalline ruins on them. Obelisks, pyramids, domes. It's fascinating. And those obelisks, pyramids, and domes only constitute what is visible on the surface. The ancient builder race spent a lot more energy building inside these moons and planets than they did on the surface. We're talking about vast regions that are habitable, where all you really need to do is seal off the door and reintroduce air, and you've now pressurized an environment that can be reoccupied. The people that were involved in this ancient builder race seem to have mysteriously disappeared, and the cultures that came after them worshipped them as gods. They felt that this was some very fascinating thing, and they would emulate their architecture. So the people who were on the super Earth that we call the progenitor race, and the people that were on Mars, which was again a captured moon of that super Earth, they actually built their own structures that were very similar to what they found all throughout our solar system. They built obelisks, they built pyramids. And this is why, when you go back to the work of Richard C. Hoagland and others who have followed up on that, when you go back to the original NASA imagery of the Martian surface from 1976, there are 2 frames that really matter. And when you compare what's on these 2 frames, you clearly see a face on Mars that has bilateral symmetry, meaning there's eyes on either side, there's a clear nose, there's a clear mouth, and then a very obvious headdress that goes around the top. NASA has gone far out of its way to try to debunk the existence of this, but all they've done is to show us inferior imagery. The original photographs are still the best, and in the aftermath, when they re-imaged it with new satellites, they actually removed a lot of the contrast, and they took out all of the shadow information that would allow you to construct a true 3-dimensional reconstruction of this. So you have to realize that Mars, to this day, has the face on Mars right there, and then immediately to the west, you have a city of what obviously look like pyramids, which apparently again were emulations of the ancient builder race crystal pyramids that they had found throughout our solar system and beyond. Then, even more fascinating.
Our dear friend David Wilcock reportedly passed away just the other day. And this is the interview that kind of just goes over from a beginning to end of the story that's out there, and it gets told lots of different times, different parts of it, and this is a pretty good collection of it all just together in one piece. This is special extra material that is part of something that I purchased of a free movie. You can watch this movie for free on YouTube. But this is the extra stuff, and since he has passed, I wanted to share this, and I need a little bit of a snack break for the moment, and in the interim, I'll give you a little bit of my history here.
immediately south of the face on Mars, there is a gigantic pyramid estimated to be 1.5 miles wide. And this pyramid is clearly pentagonal, five-sided. But what is even more fascinating than that is that the actual structure of the five-sided pyramid is not perfectly symmetrical for each side. There are 2 of the 5 corners at the top that are narrower than the others. And when you actually look at the pyramid, it is the 5-star human pattern of the human body that determines where the edges are, where the corners are. You can literally take Leonardo da Vinci's image of the Vitruvian Man that we're all so familiar with, where you see the 5-sided nature of the arms, legs, and the top of the head. You can superimpose the Vitruvian Man on top of what's called the D&M pyramid on Mars, and it precisely fits. What does that mean? That means the 5-sided pyramid on Mars is anthropomorphic. It is a human image. It is a pyramid built in a human image. And then, wait a minute, isn't there a human face right up there to the north? Yes. You have 3 architectural sites: the face on Mars, the city of pyramids, and the 5-sided pyramid. They are geologically unique. They are distinctively different than natural formations. And you can analyze the whole surface of Mars, and there's no other place that has this much unique, quote-unquote, geology as what you see in this one area. So again, this civilization that was on Mars was very aware of the ancient builder race, and that these ruins, as their civilization evolved, they discovered these ruins were very extensive, were always made out of crystal, and there's all these different places you can go where you can go inside the moon and find an enormous city's worth of space built out inside the moon, and this ancient builder race just left. There's no bodies, there's no sarcophagi, there's no remnants of what these people might have even looked like necessarily. Some of the insiders that I spoke to had reason to believe that the original progenitor race may have been feline humanoids, that they had a cat-like face. There is some speculation about that. Now, it's also important to point out that the ancient builder race did apparently come to Earth at one point. So we have this very interesting area in Africa where an archaeological dig was done in rock strata that are 2.6 billion years old. And this area is called Klerksdorp. Now, in this rock strata that is proven by carbon dating to be 2.6 billion years old, a wide number of spheres were dug out. And these spheres, in multiple cases, have a very clear structure of 3 lines that are all parallel to each other directly along the equator. The dating of these spheres is 2.6 billion years old. They are clearly artificial. They are clearly not a geological formation. They were carved by someone, and that timeline fits in perfectly with when we see the ancient builder race coming into existence. This is also a distinctly fascinating correlation because for many years I have found connections between what the insiders are telling me about the secret space program and a unique body of material called the Law of One. The Law of One material claims to be given to us by extraterrestrials through a telepathic communication. I lived with the people who did this telepathic communication for 2 years. Their group is called L&L Research. The source of the Law of One claims that they originated on the planet Venus when Venus was Earth-like. They were similar to us, as in third density, third dimensional, if you will. And they said that they date back 2.6 billion years ago. Now that is amazing because we didn't know about the Klerksdorp spheres back then. And yet, the dating that they gave in the Law of One for when they were third dimensional like us is exactly the same as the dating of the Klerksdorp spheres. And best of all, in the Law of One, they say that they had a particular affinity for the pyramid shape and that they built it extensively. Therefore, it does appear that the solution to the mystery of who is the ancient builder race is that it was the group identified now as Ra, the group that actually gave us the log 1 material, the same group that ultimately contacts Corey Good, appearing as blue avians, now in 6th density, billions of years later after they were like us. They are the most evolved extraterrestrial group that has ever been involved with humanity. It does appear, based on some very kind of understated things they say in the Log 1, that they had quite a vast civilization, that they spread out to many neighboring stars. This is the ancient builder race. They colonized all the neighboring stars in our solar system. And another very important point that we learned from the secret space program investigations is that this entire area of stars, this local group of about 54 stars, were all under the protection of moons that had become essentially weaponized. These moons, if anybody tried to invade, they would detect if there was a negative intention and zap them with some kind of particle beam that would destroy whatever was trying to invade. Therefore, we lived in a uniquely protected area of galactic space where these moons would repel any such attacks. Therefore, all of the civilizations from the 2.6 billion year ago period up to a recent past date that we'll get into in a second, all of those civilizations existed as a sort of Garden of Eden, a protected land. And therefore, any populations that arose on those planets could evolve without ever having to worry about any unauthorized extraterrestrial attacks or interventions. This all changed 500,000 years ago when the progenitor race on the super Earth and Mars actually figured out how to hack into one of these moons and use it offensively as a weapon of war rather than as a benevolent defense grid to prevent outside invasion. They were able to use these Death Stars. It caused the super Earth to explode, and what nobody foresaw was that some sort of universal free will principle was breached. And when the moon was used in anger as a weapon, the entire protected grid for all of these 54 stars was taken down. And now, as of 500,000 years ago, any extraterrestrial group that wanted to could come in and could essentially invade our little protected garden and start messing around. The first group to invade, it only took about 15 to 20,000 years. That group is called the genetic farmer race, but it's not one race. What we have here is multiple extraterrestrial civilizations from all over the galaxy that come into our solar system specifically to tinker around with the genetics of the people on these planets, and Earth is one of those planets. So what we have on Earth is a wide variety of different extraterrestrial races that cherry-picked DNA from all over the galaxy. Let's look at this particular population, let's look at this particular population, all of which are fundamentally human. That's a common element of everybody in the galaxy. But this particular race has a unique spiritual sense, and this particular race has telekinesis. This particular race is very telepathic. Can we identify the gene that made them have telekinesis or telepathy, or made them uniquely resilient? And can we chop that out and then make our own designer humans that have the best of everything? I know it sounds a little corny, but that's apparently what Earth is. We have a huge amount of DNA cherry-picked from all over the galaxy to have the best of everything. Now, this introduced some very unique elements to what it means to be human. It appears that we are a lot more emotional than most extraterrestrial races ever get. That emotionality is a great weakness for us because it can be easily manipulated so that we can have low self-esteem. We also, however, have a springboard in that emotionality because that deep emotionality allows us to grow spiritually at a much faster rate. So when that emotional nature is activated within us, and we can work through the trauma and our past pains and fears, we have the capability to evolve and to ascend into the next level of human evolution much, much faster. Another very important point to note here is that the DNA changes that the genetic farmers put in us are at this point still predominantly dormant. They are, if you will, locked up in the 95+% of our DNA that appears to be not normally used, that our scientists call junk DNA. What I find particularly fascinating about this is that once our sun goes through this energetic change, this solar flash, that dormant DNA is activated, and there are regions of space outside our solar system that already have that energetic frequency. So one of the things that I've heard from multiple insiders, actually, who have worked in the secret space program, and particularly Corey Good has given me the most detail on this, is that they would take people from Earth and fly them into these regions of higher energy and observe what happens to them as they are energized by this DNA activation. And what occurs is different depending on what type of person you have. If you have a person who is predominantly materialistic in nature, self-centered, self-focused, when they go into that energy, they have a meltdown. They freak out. They feel like they're going crazy. They start to display signs of advanced mental illness. They'll be screaming. They'll be beating their fists on the wall. They will display extreme agitation and actually become dangerous to themselves and to others. If you have a person, however, who is spiritually inclined, who has experienced alternative consciousness states through meditation or through ingesting psychedelic drugs, they will go completely blissed out. They will sit there, they will meditate, they close their eyes, they have a big smile on their face, they start hearing people's thoughts, they might be able to move things with their mind now, and they actually handle it quite well. So we also hear that in the modern day secret space program, many extraterrestrial groups are now coming in to abduct people from here, specifically to splice their DNA from Earth into their own extraterrestrial home race DNA, because we are so spring-loaded for ascension that by simply blending human DNA into an extraterrestrial race, they themselves get a temporary burst of superpowers. But this also makes extraterrestrial races, especially the negative ones, very afraid of us, because when we go through this ascension activation, when our DNA that is lying dormant right now gets switched on, we literally become like superheroes. And even one human being who is activated fully with this dormant DNA could defeat entire races of negative extraterrestrials that have come in. This is how powerful we are, because we are a designer race. We're literally the hot rod of the galaxy. All the best stuff was brought in here starting about 480,000 years ago when the protective grid went down. So that's the positive side of things. We are spring-loaded for ascension. The negative side of things takes place somewhere in the neighborhood of 450,000 years ago. And this is where the Draco reptilians first noticed that the protective grid was down, and they could come in and start messing around with these planets. So at that time, 450,000 years ago, is when we have the so-called mitochondrial Eve, the original example of the reptilians tampering with humans on Earth and starting to introduce their own reptilian genetics. This has a lot to do with the Anunnaki that Zecharia Sitchin talk about. You are dealing with an actual reptilian race that came to the Earth and started to modify our DNA with their own. And part of the original purpose of that, as Sitchin and other scholars have noted from the Sumerian cuneiform tablets, is the mining of gold. What we don't really see is what that gold was used for. Now, if you look at the Sitchin reports, he believes that the gold created a microfilm layer that went around a planet's atmosphere to protect it from solar radiation and from the atmosphere leaving. And that may very well be part of what they were doing. However, I've had other insiders, such as Jacob, a high-level insider who worked for the Rothschilds and came forward to me as a whistleblower, really never talked to anyone else but me. He told me that gold actually has some 200 different properties that it could be used for. And another interesting thing is that the qualities of the gold are distinctly dependent on where on Earth it is formed. In the formation of the gold, you will have different energetic properties and characteristics depending on where it is mined. So this is an interesting point. The gold has incredible technological value and incredible value in terms of what it does to a body. And not just a human body, but extraterrestrials as well. So all of this cosmic history of what happened after the grid went down and these beings start to come in, the genetic farmers, again, immediately after the grid goes down, followed by the reptilians, has to do with a war that has been fought in our space ever since. The genetic farmer groups would represent more of the benevolent extraterrestrials, and the reptilians would represent more of the negative extraterrestrials. At the same time, you have what we're calling the progenitors, which are the survivors of this catastrophe. So, to get back to now what happened with the progenitors after this solar flash that was particularly nasty. They steered the moon in front of the sun before this huge solar flash. About 20 billion people in their population died as the solar flash wiped out the moon, and a small number of them escaped in ships and made it to the Earth. This was 55,000 years ago. They landed in Antarctica, where there is apparently a pyramid that, if you could see it without the ice, is much larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. And that pyramid also represented a landmark for the surface feature of something that is predominantly underground. There are enormous ancient builder race ruins underneath the surface in Antarctica. The progenitors crash landed in Antarctica, but at the time the Earth was on a different axial tilt, and Antarctica was not covered by ice. When they got here 55,000 years ago, their mothership needed to be retrofitted to become a base. And what they started to do was to clone out their genetic materials with the indigenous Earth population, because their goal actually was to take over the Earth. But they didn't have a very large population. So in order to avoid cloning problems, where you have a very small stock of people who are cloned and then they're all essentially inbred, you have to use a widespread genetic sample to make sure that you have enough genetic diversity that this cloning problem doesn't happen. So the people who crash landed in what we now call Antarctica began to introduce their DNA into genetic human stocks from Earth. And those people who were cloned out had elongated skulls. There were apparently 2 royal lineages that go all the way back to the source planets themselves of Tiamat or Maldek, and they have slightly different physiologies. When you look at the elongated skulls, some of the elongated skulls have a distinct bun-like bump that looks almost like there's a ball there, the surface of a ball. Other elongated skulls that you'll notice have a very smooth slope and do not have that bump. This apparently refers to the 2 major types of extraterrestrial lineages from this exploded planet that came here. And what I find uniquely fascinating is that once they crash landed on Earth 55,000 years ago, they quickly made a treaty with each other. Even though they were at war, they decided to coexist on the Earth. And one lineage said, we will take what we would now call Africa and Europe. The other lineage said, we will take South America, North America, and the eastern half of Asia. Now, what is really fascinating is that you look at the pyramid architecture that occurred in the aftermath of this treaty, and what you have is each of these original lineages having a unique architectural style. So let's talk, for example, about the pyramids that you see in Egypt and in other areas of Africa, and how those pyramids have smooth walls going up that are very distinctly not terraced. I mean, there is the step pyramid of Zoser in Saqqara, Egypt, and that one does have courses going up. But then let's look to Mesoamerica, and we notice there is a distinct variance in the architectural style, where now you have step pyramids almost consistently with different courses. What most people are not aware of, however, is that in the area of Cambodia, you have an architectural site called Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat, first of all, is very unique because if you look at the architecture of Angkor Wat and you compare it to the architecture of the temples in India, they're basically identical. Look at Angkor Wat and look at how you have a square area and you have these towers that come up on each of the corners of the square. They're very ornate, they're almost like obelisks, and they have a unique shape. When we then go back to India and we look at the oldest temples, such as, for example, Khajuraho, we see the exact same architectural style. At Angkor Wat, we have a very unique outlay of different pyramidal type sites. And according to the work of Graham Hancock, those different architectural sites, although they appear to be randomly positioned, actually align with the constellation Draco. If you take the positions of the pyramids at Angkor Wat and you play connect the dots, all of the seemingly random positions that they have perfectly line up with the arrangement of stars in the constellation Draco. And what's best of all is that there is a drift in the Earth's axis called the precession of the equinoxes, and the alignment of where the landforms in Angkor Wat line up with the position of this Draco constellation. It only works if you go back 12,500 years ago, which is precisely the same as the alignment that everybody's familiar with of the pyramids of Giza with the stars in the belt of the constellation of Orion. Once again, it all points back to 12,500 years ago. This being the most recent Atlantean cataclysm, which actually caused the Earth to shift on its axis, caused what was called Atlantis to be flooded out, and then the waters froze and Atlantis becomes Antarctica. Prior to this catastrophe, Antarctica, as we now know it, was a livable continent that had subtropical climate and was the main place where these descendants of Mars and Maldek/Tiamat were living. Another thing I want to point out that is very fascinating about Angkor Wat is that you look at some of the temples in that area, and I want to specifically focus on one called Bakse Cham Krong. Okay? Let's take a look now at Bakse Cham Krong. And what are you going to notice? Oh my God. It looks exactly like the step pyramids in Mesoamerica. You have courses going up, you have a stairwell in the front, and even the number of courses is precisely the same as some of the architecture that we see in Mesoamerica, such as El Castillo or the castle, where you got 7 courses going up from the bottom. You can even superimpose this particular architectural site that's outside of Mexico City with Bakse Cham Krong, and they look almost identical. You can overlay them right on top of each other. As you look at this overlay, notice the perfection of how the two fit together. This is not a different society. This is a unified society, but wait a minute. we've got Mesoamerica and we've got Cambodia, separated by the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, and yet they are using the same architecture. And there are other pyramid-like ruins in Angkor Wat that also look exactly like what we see in Mesoamerica, the same basic architectural design. So according to the historical records, this is the style of the group that got to take over the Americas and the eastern half of Asia, which includes Cambodia. These two groups coexisted on the earth, and they got here 55,000 years ago, and they built up a very powerful civilization. They had about 5,000 years to become extremely prodigious on earth. And at that point, there was an enormous war. The main part of their civilization that got the most technologically advanced was in the northern third of Africa. And the war that occurred at that time, which is now roughly 50,000 years ago, was so devastating that the entire area they had colonized got completely baked out and turned into what we now call the Sahara Desert. If you look at Africa, the whole top third of Africa is not green anymore, it's all tan because it's a big giant desert, the Sahara Desert. Multiple insiders have told me that if you dig down in that desert, almost anywhere, between 40 to 1,000 feet down in the sand, it's all ruins, it's all architecture. And another really interesting thing is there is some amazing architecture down there that has been discovered by 3D underground mapping, systems like LiDAR, but much more advanced. And then, if you go over to Mesoamerica, they weren't able to hide that, because throughout Mesoamerica, we have the Olmec race, where these giant stone heads have been dug up, and they very clearly, again, have African features. But wait a minute, what are these guys doing over in Mesoamerica? They're not supposed to be Africans in Mesoamerica, and yet they clearly have those features. This appears to have been another extraterrestrial race that came in at the time, was not part of this original progenitor race, but actually came in to help us in later times and built statues of themselves. So what's happening here is that 50,000 years ago, this huge civilization got wiped out, and we have the Sahara Desert resulting. There's still an enormous number of ruins down there, and that included books from the original exploded planet and from Mars. Books that are 500,000 plus years old. The Egyptian priesthood was conducting multiple archaeological digs and found these books. And as I've talked about in so many other cases, they stored all of this material in the Library of Alexandria. And when the Library of Alexandria was supposedly burned by Caesar, they simply moved all the good stuff over to the Vatican Library. And all they actually burned was tax documents and census documents, which they didn't feel like they needed anyway. So the Vatican Library contains books that are incredibly old, that include pictures of actual detailed blueprints of extraterrestrial craft, of huge bases, motherships, an amazing wealth of knowledge and information that has been hidden from us by the Vatican. And what do we see in the Vatican? We see people walking around with mitre hats that can hide the elongated skulls. So to really encompass this cosmic history, we have to then get into the more disturbing aspect of this, which is that the people who crash landed in Antarctica that had the elongated skull physiology, again, they cloned themselves out. The clones were considered the royal caste, and those clones went out with their gravity-defeating technology and built pyramids around the earth, took on the role of the elite in Egypt and Mesoamerica and elsewhere. And as time progresses, there was a catastrophe 50,000 years ago that wiped out their civilization, turned it into the Sahara Desert. Some of them survived. There was another catastrophe correlating with the solar flash 25,000 years ago that caused extensive damage. And then there was yet another solar flash 12,500 years ago. At the halfway point of of the 25,000-year cycle, which apparently the sun can have a flash at that point as well.
Part 2. Thank you, David, for sharing all of this incredible information. This incredible data, in your words.
It's also important to point out that the people who were cloned out from this physiology of the progenitor race had a very distinctive difference in how they looked from everyone else. And the core of the genetic difference comes in things like white skin and red hair or blonde hair. So there are many reports from all over the world of red-haired giants being found. And another interesting thing is that many of these giants were actually found with their skulls having 2 sets of teeth. In other words, there is a visible row of teeth that you can see breaking through the gums, but if you actually look at the skull itself, inside there is a second row of teeth that are not visible, that are embedded in the bone. Interestingly enough, this same phenomena has been found in reports of genetic cloning of different types of animals, specifically when you try to blend together 2 species that might not really mesh that well. So this is a puzzle that a lot of the giant researchers have found that wasn't explainable before now. Another confusing aspect of this history is that the original progenitor race in what we now call Antarctica designed different types of human beings and clones for different purposes. So we do have the ruling caste people who are the same height as humans are now on Earth, perhaps slightly taller. But then they also deliberately designed other humans that were built to be giants. And this was more of the warrior caste, the military, if you will. Their imposing size allowed them to be able to provide security, and also it made it much easier for them to manipulate large stones as needed for the building of these giant monuments. When we go back to the idea of the genetic farmer race, remember that this is a term that was devised by the secret space program, who has admittedly a derogatory view of them and their role in our evolution. So the term genetic farmer is not a particularly spiritually enlightened sounding term. It almost implies that they are interlopers, that they've farmed us in some way. But from the perspective of positive spiritual teachings, what we would think of as the genetic farmers would be angelic races of beings. These are benevolent beings. They do not directly interfere with us. At times, they will show up as gods or angels on earth, but they predominantly have a position of non-interference. They have modified our DNA. They want us to be ready for ascension. They want us to be ready for human transfiguration. But they do this without interfering with our free will. They stay off in the distance. They don't get involved too much. They're aware of the reptilians. They are certainly at war with the reptilians. And they are aware of the progenitors. And they would be at war to some degree with the progenitors as well. This war between angelic beings and the so-called progenitor race really only reached a head at the time of 12,500 years ago. The angelic races, or what is now called in the Bible the Elohim, they were not interested in seeing these negative groups continue to dominate the planet. So 12,500 years ago, certain individuals were given information about the next catastrophe that was soon to arrive, and they were told, you're going to have to survive this, you're going to have to keep humanity alive. This is an important element of Zecharia Sitchin's work that parlays into many other things. The idea that the story of the biblical flood of Noah is much older than the conventional biblical chronology, dating it back to maybe 3,300 years ago at the most, or 3,300 BC in some interpretations. What most people are not aware of is that the book of Genesis and the story of Noah surviving the flood is a very condensed version of a story that appears in a much larger form in the Sumerian cuneiform tablets, where it is called the Epic Saga of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh being apparently a different name for Noah. What is so interesting from this perspective is that Noah's grandfather in the Bible is called Enoch. And there is an apocryphal gospel, there is a lost book of the Bible called the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch is of critical historical significance. It very likely was wiped out by the people from the Egyptian priesthood and how they merged with the Romans, and how that group then goes and forms the Roman Empire, because this Book of Enoch reveals who they are and why they lost this war, really. The war that was being fought with angelic extraterrestrials, or what is called Elohim. One of the things that was done to Christianity and to religion as a whole was to greatly simplify the records in these books. So, for example, the term Elohim is fundamentally plural. And yet, when you see what happens in the Bible, Elohim is shortened to a singular pronoun, to a singular God. The original term refers to groups of beings. And in the Book of Enoch, what we have is the people with the elongated skulls, the red hair, the giants, and also the ones that are of conventional size, becoming aware, basically at the last minute, that there is going to be a massive catastrophe, that there's going to be a solar flash, that it will greatly damage or destroy their civilization. And what the secret space program calls the genetic farmer race, what we would call the angels or the Elohim, were petitioned by the ruling caste on earth for salvation. The progenitor said, please save us from this horrible catastrophe, and we will give you whatever you want. But the Elohim were looking at this group, and this is all documented very precisely in the Book of Enoch. They looked at this group and they said, what you're doing is wrong. You have dominated the planet. You are overpowering the native humans on Earth and using them for slave labor. You're sexually exploiting them with rape. Some of your giants are eating these people. You are engaging in cannibalism. That is forbidden. And you also have taken your own genetic material and you've started to experiment with mixing human genetics with animals, creating chimeras. This includes things like the centaur, which is the human in the horse, where you have the four legs of the horse and then another two limbs of the human torso that apparently was real. You have things like the minotaur, where you have a part bull, part human being. And you have various other forms of this that were being done. Apparently in Antarctica, there have now been found the original genetic laboratories where this was being done, and skeletons of chimeras of different types, blending human and animal genetics together. And they were doing this for slave labor and to have workers of various sorts. It is very interesting to me when you look at the records of the American psychic and clairvoyant Edgar Cayce, who was born in 1877, died in 1945. He talks about that there were 3 Atlantean catastrophes, and the dates are exactly the same as what the research shows when we actually look at catastrophic events on Earth. A 50,000-year-old catastrophe, a 25,000-year-old catastrophe, and a 12,500-year-old catastrophe. We also find that the Cayce reading spoke of the manipulation of animal DNA and human DNA in what they called things. And we also have a lot of information that dovetails very nicely with what's in the Book of Enoch. So let's go back to the book of a human-year-old catastrophe and a 12,500-year-old catastrophe. We also find that the Casey reading spoke of the manipulation of animal DNA and human DNA in what they called things. And we also have a lot of information that dovetails very nicely with what's in the Book of Enoch. So let's go back to the Book of Enoch for a second and really explore this. What happens is that this ruling caste on earth found out that the people who were not of their ilk, the people who were conventional humans, were going to be saved. And this is the actual true story of Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is much more complex than what we've been led to believe. It is not a simple example of a wooden boat of which they think they found it on Mount Ararat in Turkey, right? Noah's Ark, don't think about a boat. In fact, when you read the book of Genesis, it clearly appears to be some sort of cube. And that doesn't even really jive with the idea of a floating boat structure. Noah's Ark actually appears to be an extraterrestrial craft. And with the primitive language of the day, it was simply described with boat-like characteristics, or maybe that's even the hand-me-down from the original. But when you look at Noah's Ark and that story, what do you see? Let's take breeding pairs of each type of animal on Earth. Let's make sure that they're all stored in the ark. Let's take various people on Earth and make sure that they are preserved. This is really the same concept as the idea of a whole moon that has 10,000 floors inside, where you can take animals, you can take plants, you can take ocean water, and you can take whole human populations and store them in the event of a catastrophe. So Noah's Ark becomes much bigger, much more interesting, and carries a lot more people and a lot more animals than we normally would give it credit for. It's essentially a sci-fi story described in conventional language now, where it appears to be a boat that's floating on the water. It had nothing to do with floating on the water. It wasn't even on Earth. The people who were the ruling caste, the progenitors, they wanted to be saved, and they petitioned the Elohim for rescue, and they were turned down. The Elohim said to them, "You are wicked, you are raping people, you are cloning humans and animals, which you are not allowed to do by the laws of the universe. You have committed acts of genocide, you have committed acts of atrocities, and we are not going to save you." They petitioned the Elohim through an individual on Earth called Enoch, who occupied a similar role at that time as what Corey Goode is doing now. Corey Goode actually was used as an intermediary by the reptilians in modern times to request from the Elohim, as we would now call them, for the reptilians to be saved, because they are now expecting a solar flash in our time. And the reptilians, again, were turned down. But another fascinating thing is that the reptilians are now essentially controlling what we would call the deep state, the cabal, or the Illuminati on Earth. And the reptilians, when they were trying to make a deal for their own salvation from this latest solar flash that is expected to occur, were willing to offer up all of their underlings, all of the slave races of extraterrestrials that they control, and all of the so-called Illuminati on Earth. They said, "We'll give everybody up. You can do anything with them that you want. You can imprison them, you can torture them, you can kill them. We don't care. Just let us go." Because apparently the Elohim have created an impenetrable barrier around our solar system. The reptilians cannot escape. And when the solar flash happens, they will be completely wiped out. So they were denied exit in this time in history, just like they were denied exit 12,500 years ago. So what then happens is, you have the biblical flood of Noah, which is the Atlantean flood that occurs 12,500 years ago. And there is extensive research that has been conducted to suggest that the catastrophe that led to the Atlantean flood was a solar flash. A lot of this work was done by the geologist Robert Schoch in his book, Forgotten Civilization. My research is mentioned in the book at one point, as well as many others. What we see is evidence that the Earth was given a huge solar flash at this time. When we look throughout Europe, we find multiple examples of what are called vitrified forts, where you have piles of rock that appear to have been loosely stacked originally in berms that go on for some length, like a wall. And now, when you go to these berms of rock, they have all been melted together.
Snack time. Hey Siri, turn the lights to 50%.
And what's fascinating is that the only way you could do that is with a sustained burn of heat at 1,000 degrees Celsius. We also see several examples throughout the area of Giza in Egypt, such as the plateau, flat stone areas around the Sphinx and the pyramids, where they again clearly seem to have been heated at a very high temperature, even to the point where the surface has been blackened. Another really interesting fact is that 12,500 years ago, throughout almost the entire northern hemisphere of the Earth, if you look at the geological records, there is a 5-inch thick layer of soot, which clearly implies a massive burning of the Earth's surface by some sort of massive solar catastrophe. We also find similar ruins on the moon. When you look at the geology of the moon, and you look at the time.
I need a battery assist.
roughly 12,500 years ago, where you get microspheres and pieces of glass where the regolith of the lunar surface is actually heated up and turned into a type of glass material, which again requires an extraordinary sustained burn of outside heat. And the only physical source is the sun. So the Atlantean catastrophe was apparently a solar flash, and part of what happened is that the oceans are heated up, and there's an enormous amount of rain precipitation. We also apparently got shifting axis that caused Atlantis, which was visible, to go to the South Pole, and then when it floods out from all the water that's evaporated, and that water then freezes into ice, you now have the formation of Antarctica. So Antarctica apparently has enormous areas under the ice where there are pyramids that look like the ones you see in Mesoamerica. And we have the motherships that were frozen down there, which our own secret space program has extensively been studying since they were identified by the Germans in the 1930s. The original German submarines or U-boats found that there were tunnels under the ice that they could get into in Antarctica. And when they sailed in there, they found these domes inside the ice where there's air you can breathe. And the natural volcanic activity of the crust at the bottom of the glacier causes this whole domed area to melt. And the Germans literally went in there in the 1930s and found ruined pyramids and stuff. And they found that there were entrances to underground areas where they could go in, they could pressurize them, they could clean them up, and they could make huge bases down there. So the Germans had a serious head start from the rest of the world in modern times in finding this lost Atlantis. So the Elohim were petitioned for these negative groups on Earth to be saved, and the Elohim said no. The Elohim then decided to custom design the modern human race that we now have from the remnant that they salvaged with what we call Noah's Ark. That becomes the Adam. So Adam and Eve are not really just one group, one breeding pair of humans, because obviously if everybody is descended from one breeding pair, we would have enormous genetic problems due to intermarriage and the typical thing that happens with inbreeding. So Adam and Eve is, again, a sort of symbolic story about the fact that the people that had been on Earth were rescued before this big catastrophe. They were apparently given some additional genetic modification by the good guys, by the Elohim, by what we would think of as angels in the Bible, and then they were placed back down on Earth. So this is the Garden of Eden story. Adam and Eve are really just a symbol of the new humanity that was built to inherit the earth. Well, there are some losers in this battle. We think of as angels in the Bible, and then they were placed back down on earth. So this is the Garden of Eden story. Adam and Eve are really just a symbol of the new humanity that was built to inherit the earth. Well, there are some losers in this battle. It's the people with the elongated skulls. They did not all die in the Atlantean catastrophe, but they were greatly, greatly reduced in their power, to the point where they essentially had to live like cavemen, but they still had books and records of who they were, and they felt that they had been the gods, that they had controlled the planet, and they lost control of the planet. So in the book of Enoch, what you have is the story of what we would now think of as Lucifer. And there is critical significance in understanding this. The people with the elongated skulls believed themselves to be the rightful rulers of the earth. And they believed that the Elohim were evil because the Elohim decided they should be destroyed in the biblical flood. So it naturally stands to reason that they would create a religion in which the Elohim are evil, and And therefore, any representatives of the Elohim who showed up on earth, such as Jesus, would then be reinterpreted as being evil. And the God the Father that Jesus refers to is now a negative God. Well, this actually shows up in the religion that has come to be known as Gnosticism. The Gnostic Gospels supposedly came from the Nag Hammadi scrolls that were found, where you have other books from the time of the Bible that were not included in the Bible. So Gnostic Gospels, Gnostic scriptures, are used by this group to justify their religion. What they do then is they look at the atrocity as they see it of the Elohim refusing to save them, and they say whatever God these Elohim are calling God is clearly not God, because it caused us to be killed. Therefore, the Abrahamic religions, which is Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, the God that the Abrahamic religions worship must be evil. So the way the Gnostic Gospels are reinterpreted is to say that the God that the Abrahamic religions worship is a half-God or demi-urge, an evil interloper. And then they even go farther to say, well, let's look at this story that the Elohim are telling. The Elohim are saying that the brightest angel in God's pantheon, Lucifer, was thrown out. Well, wait a minute. That must be the good guy, because we think that the people who killed us off are evil for killing us off. Okay, that means Lucifer's the good guy. Let's build a whole religion around the idea that the God that killed us off is evil, and that the person who was thrown out is good. Now, let's think back to the idea that these people have been living on the moon, that the moon gets hit by a solar flash, and a very small amount of their ruling caste survived by fleeing at the last minute and crash landing on Earth. They are the fallen angels. The fallen angel Lucifer. They actually believe Lucifer is a flesh and blood extraterrestrial being, the leader of these fallen angels, of which in the book of Enoch it says there were about 200. It's probably a lot more than that, but not an enormous population by any means. Lucifer is the leader of the fallen angels who crash landed here on Earth. It's therefore very interesting to note that the Rockefeller faction was allowed to develop the predominant money-making business in the Americas, which was the oil business, and the control of things like the railroad and later the automobile industry. What the European elites did not see was that the oil business would become so lucrative from the Industrial Revolution that was born in the Americas that it became the predominant business that generated the most money on Earth, thus allowing the Rockefeller faction to create actual competition with the Rothschild faction. According to the insider information given to us by Corey Good and others, when the Rockefeller faction became the elite here in the Americas, they regained access to the Mesoamerican Mayan priesthoods that still existed in secret and had the elongating skulls. So what we're literally dealing with in terms of the Rockefeller faction and the Rothschild faction, the European faction that would represent the traditional Democratic Party in U.S. presidential elections versus the Rockefeller faction that traditionally represented the Republican faction in U.S. presidential elections, is a division of royal lineages that goes back literally 500 million years to the progenitor race and their origins on the exploded planet and Mars. It's also interesting to note that these two original royal lineages fell out of contact with each other after the Atlantean catastrophe. They were separated by oceans. And it wasn't until the time of Columbus, secretly financed by the Queen, that these groups were able to reconnect. That the elongated skull priesthoods in Mesoamerica finally reacquainted themselves with the surviving remnant that was in Egypt and Rome at the time. So it's very important to note that the things that we look at in the Bible as being metaphorical or as being somehow just a quaint myth are actually real stories. They are real pieces of information. And this includes the idea of Jesus arriving. By the time Jesus arrived, you already have a Roman Empire that is directly worshiping Lucifer, that brought in the Carthaginian gods of Baal and Moloch, and were actually summoning these demonic entities. They would draw a magic circle. They would literally draw a pentagram on the ground. They have candles in each of the 5 corners of the pentagram. They would seal it with human blood in a sacrifice that they did. And then they would have a demonic creature appear inside the magic circle, materialize, a reptilian, that they could then bid and contract to get to do what they wanted. Another very important aspect of this is what happens to the human body when it's tortured to death. As we experience a very fearful death, our bodies give off a substance known as dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, and this essentially prepares us for death. DMT can also be extracted through various other substances, such as psychedelic mushrooms like psilocybin and Amanita muscaria. And of course, most people are familiar with the ayahuasca, which is a combination of 2 cofactors that make it work that way from the Amazonian and other jungle regions in Mesoamerica. What most people are not aware of is that when a person is tortured, their body gives off a lot of natural DMT, and the rite of drinking blood causes you to ingest that DMT and to have a psychedelic experience. Now, I think it's insane to try to have a DMT experience through drinking human blood. It's certainly not an advisable thing for anyone to do, because you are now on the negative path. You are participating in evil. But I will say that they have discovered that this does create a psychedelic experience. They've identified the substance, if you will, in blood. They call it adrenochrome. And apparently when you drink this blood, you will then be able to see these reptilians. They become visible to you because you are now tripping. So people always say, well, where are these reptilians? And I want to make it very clear that we all see them in our dreams. The reptilians are very much a part of our reality, and in our dream space, they may show up exactly as how they really look, or they may show up as some modified form of how they look, because in the dream plane, a being can display itself without looking exactly like what it does, but having a sort of symbolic representation of that. But I do also want to be clear, once again, that when people...
Say that again, David, about symbolic representation?
Sacrifice to human beings, a symbolic form of how they look, because in the dream, our reality, and in our dream space, they may show up exactly as how they really look, or they may show up as some modified form of how they look, because in the dream plane, a being can display itself without looking exactly like what it does, but having a sort of symbolic representation of that. But I do also want to be clear, once again, that when people have sacrificed a human being and they drink the blood, they are essentially getting a DMT high, which will create the opportunity for full visual hallucinations. Not the kind of stuff off the side, but stuff that you normally couldn't see from the spiritual realm, if you will. It's right in front of your face. So when they do this magic circle, it is the added effect of the DMT that allows these demonic entities to become visible inside the pentagram. Now, the Romans were doing this, and the so-called technology got lost after a period of time, but was then rediscovered by the regime of Queen Elizabeth, the original Queen Elizabeth in the 1500s. Her court astrologer, John Dee, discovered these ancient texts, figured out that there was a series of rites that you could do, including human sacrifice, to access these entities. They performed these rites according to multiple witnesses that I've spoken to from the Illuminati, and they saw the beings, they saw the reptilians, and they got the reptilians to do their bidding. it's again very important to remember that even before the time of Jesus, the Romans had already, as of 55 BC with Caesar, invaded England and had started to build bathhouses there. The whole city of Bath in England is a Roman settlement where the original Roman baths are still there to this day. And Bath also has not been modified that much from its historic roots. Therefore, a lot of films are shot there because it's very period looking. And I've been through Bath, and I've seen the whole thing, including the Roman baths. Quite fascinating. Jesus arrives, and what Jesus really did was to destroy this reptilian and progenitor race agenda. At the time, the people with the elongated skulls were planning out a whole path of world domination. And you have to remember, too, that the reptilians and the people with the elongated skulls at various times were in treaty with one another, where they would work together, and at other times they were at war with one another, and they had distinctly opposite agendas. The reptilians in general have had less of an involved role on Earth, and the people with the elongated skulls, because they're here and their genetics are here, they were much more involved. So Jesus' arrival causes such a significant challenge to this power structure that it really posed a huge problem for them. They already had a plan for global domination that would have been a Luciferian New World Order. They were working towards this. Jesus comes in and provides a monotheistic model that focuses on service to others and love, which, remember, they believe these qualities are created by a false god to keep us imprisoned. They believed in the Luciferian religion, at the higher levels at least, that things like ethics and morality were introduced by the demiurge to keep us as slaves. They do not think that most people on earth are actually equal to them. They believe that we are useless eaters. They believe that they must greatly depopulate the planet in order to fulfill their agenda. So when Jesus shows up, what do they need to do? They need to contain and control the message by any means necessary. So the actual group that Jesus came to oppose then takes over his message, and then, as of 325 AD, creates the New Testament, where they very selectively manicured Jesus' message to remove the teachings that they thought were anathema to their agenda. So apparently, Jesus spoke to one of the original apostles about reincarnation. This apostle then said reincarnation is the great secret teaching of Jesus, and then that knowledge was conveyed to Origen, who was considered one of the original founding church fathers. So we have the doctrine of reincarnation being said by Origen to be the great secret teaching of Jesus. By removing reincarnation from Christianity, the Roman elite were able to create an airtight Trinitarian doctrine, where the Trinity is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, and there's nothing else. The Holy Spirit becomes this sort of mystical thing that is not feminine. You have God the Father, which is masculine, God the Son, which is masculine, and the Holy Spirit, which is not gender. Therefore, the role of the feminine is removed from the Trinity. And this is an important point. The suppression of the feminine by the patriarchy. Apparently, wherever the Draco-Reptilians go, to any planet in the galaxy, if they wish to take that planet over, it is an intrinsic aspect of their plan to suppress the feminine, to suppress the female spirituality and the feminine perspective that would occur in governance and law and all aspects of society. I do believe that Jesus' teachings dealt a fatal blow to this so-called Luciferian Illuminati agenda. And they were left in the unenviable position of turning Jesus' teachings into an enslavement doctrine. The Illuminati actually believe that being nice to people, that forgiveness, compassion, these are tools of our enslavement. and that by being free of those encumbrances, they feel they are superior to everyone else. So part of their religion is that they will practice the extremes of both the positive and the negative path, or what they call the right-hand path and the left-hand path. So they will, for example, simultaneously create huge philanthropic endowments where they give, in some cases, many, many millions, if not billions of dollars to humanitarian causes, while simultaneously doing the most heinous crimes imaginable against humanity. I want to point out now that what Jesus was teaching us about ascension has proven to be of far greater significance than is normally given credit for. Most Christians tend to distance themselves from the idea of the so-called rapture. It's been presented as a fanciful idea of a very small number of true believers flying up into the air like kites while everyone else on earth dies in some horrible catastrophe. We also have very unfortunate misunderstandings that have been created by the interpretation of the book of Revelation in the idea that only 144,000 people will be going through this process. It is important to understand that the book of Revelation was something that happened to John Patmos as a visionary, psychedelic type of dream. And as is the nature of dreams, there's a lot of symbolism in that report. So you have aspects of truth, and you have aspects that are veiled by a certain degree of dream symbology. So, for example, the frequent repetition of the number 7, such as 7 lampstands and so forth in the book of Revelation, actually refers to the 7 chakras of the human body, the 7 energy centers that we have that correspond to the 7 basic layers of the universe, or 7 densities. This is another thing that is described extensively in the Law of One. There are 7 primary planes of existence that correspond with these 7 grades of evolution that all intelligent life must go through, of which right now we're only at the 3rd, which would be the yellow center. So you have red, orange, yellow, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, green, which is 4th density, light blue, which is 5th density, dark blue, which is 6th density, indigo, or the crown chakra, which is purple, 7th density. And then you go back to pure white light, or intelligent infinity, the original identity of the creation that we all emanate from.
Pure white.
Jesus comes here and
The
gives
color
us
tells you the
another
frequency.
example of the teaching.
The color
Ascension.
that comes to you
And of
tells you
course,
the frequency.
Jesus' own life, density, 4th density.
Hey, the chakras, they go ascend from red. Roy G. Biv, if you're a filmmaker in the digital space, that's how you manipulate colors. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Red light, danger, caution, stay away. Green light, love in this case. Purple, the crown chakra, but only when you have all 7 together, then you get pure white light. White. You can't make white unless you have equal parts of everything else.
Light blue, which is 5th density, dark blue, which is 6th density, indigo, or the crown chakra, which is purple, 7th density. And then you go back to pure white light, or intelligent infinity, the original identity of the creation that we all emanate from. Jesus comes here and gives us another example of the teaching of ascension. And of course, Jesus' own life ended in a very climactic event where he himself ascended. And I find it interesting that this doctrine of the resurrection goes well beyond the magic trick that Jesus pulled by resurrecting Lazarus from the dead. In other words, Lazarus was a human being who died. Jesus was able to lay his hands on him and bring him back to life. So Jesus had already demonstrated that. What Jesus actually does with the ascension goes well beyond the simple reanimation of a dead body. And this is told in the story of how Jesus returned to his disciples and they did not recognize him. He didn't look the same anymore. That's why they thought he was some kind of a worker. And the only way he was able to convince them, and they did not recognize him. He didn't look the same anymore. That's why they thought he was some kind of a worker. And the only way he was able to convince them that he was the same guy was by using his light body to materialize the holes in his hands from the crucifixion. At which time it then becomes, oh wow, you actually were that guy. But he obviously looked different. He had a light body. He was clearly glowing in some way. So there's a very unique difference of what happened here. And it's also important to note that the Bible describes how the apostles also ascended, that tongues of fire descended upon them. This means they are glowing. This means that they achieved light body in their own right. Now, where I feel that conventional Christianity has missed some very critical data is when we look at the fact that the ascension that Jesus is describing is actually also predicted in almost every other global spiritual tradition on earth. This goes back to the work of two of the most prominent historians of the 20th century, Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechant. They wrote a book called Hamlet's Mill that was their magnum opus, where they tied together these legends from 35 different ancient civilizations on Earth, in which all of them had information regarding this 25,000-year cycle. I've said before that the 25,000-year cycle seems to end with a solar flash, a catastrophic event which also represents a distinctive spiritual activation for those on Earth who are ready to take advantage of it. Now, that 25,000-year cycle is not just some nebulous thing. It actually has a very tangible marker in this wobble in the Earth's axis, which takes 25,000 years to complete and represents the time that is required for the stars in the night sky to drift through a complete circle. And that time interval occurs by 1 degree every 72 years. So when you multiply the 72-year period for 1 degree by 360, take 72 times 360. Now you get the full cycle, which is 25,920 years. This can actually be measured by looking at the position of the stars in the night sky at the equinox and noticing how they drift by 1 degree every 72 years. Hence, the drifting is called precession, and it's the precession of the equinoxes because you measure this at the equinox. So the stars actually represent a clock. The stars are telling us when the end of the cycle will occur, and these historians discovered that 35 cultures around the world were clocking this precession. They had all this numerical information about the precession encoded in their myths, and they said it appears that some singular source worldwide programmed these mythologies, encoded this information into them. Well, this would be what we would call the angelic groups or the positive extraterrestrials, what the secret space program people call the genetic farmer race. They knew that at the end of the cycle that we are going to go through this process. Christianity, in the Bible at least, doesn't actually predict a solar flash per se. But let's remember that the 4 main books of the Bible that are containing the direct words of Jesus are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All 4 of those core Gospels have direct ascension prophecies in them. I would say the one that has the least amount of the ascension prophecy would probably be the book of Mark, but you can still find it in there. And the one that has the most amount of ascension prophecy in it definitely is the book of Matthew. The book of Luke is pretty well loaded, because the book of Luke has some of the most amazing stuff in it, in terms of Jesus actually saying, as it was in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, so shall it be in the day of the Son of Man. Well, what does that mean? Sodom and Gomorrah ended with fire and brimstone raining from the heavens, right? So the end of the Son of Man features fire and brimstone raining from the heavens. That's the solar flash. That's the debris from the solar flash. Jesus also says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the day of the Son of Man. Well, the day of Noah ended with a big flood. So Jesus is actually talking about this global catastrophic event. In the book of John, Jesus says the fields are white and ready to harvest. So harvest is a metaphor of the ascension process. And also in the book of John, Jesus says, not one stone that you see around me now will remain standing. They will all be thrown down when this happens. You can still go to Israel today and you can see plenty of ruins from the time of Jesus, so it doesn't refer to anything that's happened up until now. Really, the key to Jesus' ascension prophecy is in the book of Matthew, and it specifically comes out the most in the parable of the wheat and the tares. Now, tares, the word, refers to weeds. One of Jesus' strange, encrypted analogies of ascension is where he describes how the earth is like a field of wheat that has been planted, but the adversary, Satan, if you will, or Lucifer, which I believe are actually the same, although Luciferians would disagree with that, the adversary is allowed to plant weeds in the garden. Now, this is an analogy where Jesus says that the wheat and the weeds are allowed to grow together until the time of the harvest. And it's only at the time of the harvest. This is where it gets really strange, okay? This is where Jesus' prophecy, like several of them, don't really seem to make sense. Another example being that the smallest seed is planted and becomes the largest tree, like the grain of mustard seed. If you have the faith of a grain of mustard seed, right? Well, the smallest seed is not going to actually become the largest tree, so that's clearly a metaphor. But when we're dealing with the metaphor of the wheat and the weeds, Jesus says we're going to let everything grow until it gets to full maturity, and then the weeds will be plucked from the crop one by one at the time of the harvest, gathered into bundles and burned in my barn. Okay? There is no way that any person could actually go through the field and pick out every single weed one by one right at the end. It doesn't make sense. The time to weed is when the crops are first coming out. Because now you can walk around without damaging anything. You see, okay, that doesn't belong there. I'll grab that. To do it at the end, I mean, you could theoretically do it, but it would be incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult not to knock over all the wheat, not to cause a lot of damage, and to try to find every single piece of weed at that point and pull it out one by one. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then, what we're seeing is that Jesus says the wheat is allowed to grow to fruition. The weeds are plucked out one by one and gathered together in bundles and burned. This is a symbol of the solar flash, because the teachings of Christianity, the teachings of all 35 of these other religious traditions that we have, every culture on earth, they all say the same thing. They all say that when this solar flash happens, if you are on the positive side, you are not affected by it except in a positive way. All you have to be is slightly more service to others, loving, forgiving, compassionate, and patient. And by having those qualities, you are able to ascend. You become like Jesus after the resurrection. That was a pattern. Jesus designed his incarnation to show us what we will go through. That's why Jesus says, as I do these things, so shall ye do them, and greater things, for I go unto my Father. Jesus is literally saying that the things he could do will be things that we could do as well. So you remember, for example, Jesus would walk up to a woman and say, I see that you have cheated on your husband. I see that you've done this. I see that you've done that. And the woman starts crying because it's totally accurate. So Jesus clearly is able to read what you know and what you have done in your life. Jesus knew people's names without them telling him their names, right? Jesus also would say things like, go to this town, and then you'll find a donkey there, and take the donkey, and if anybody gives you a hassle, just say, the Lord hath need of a donkey. So he knew exactly where they would go, so he has some kind of telepathy. Jesus clearly had psychic healing capabilities. There's very strange reports of him using some of his own DNA with his spittle, and spitting into his hand, and then wiping it in someone's eyes who's blind, and then somehow they're able to heal their sight and get their sight back. So psychic healing is another aspect. There's another case of somebody whose hand was mangled, and Jesus says, stretch forth your hand, and the hand was healed. Then we also have clearly examples of Jesus levitating, Jesus using telekinesis. Of course, the idea of him walking on water. The body can't normally walk on water. It's much, much too heavy. So we also have stories of the 5,000 loaves and fishes, where Jesus is able to feed 5,000 people from a single loaf of bread and a single fish. So there's some sort of cloning of the material that he's able to do. And again, another area that is very contentious here is that apparently there are many beings out there that have these abilities, not just Jesus. That doesn't, however, change the fact that according to the Law of One, which is again my source text that I've spent so many years studying, Jesus was the embodiment of the Logos. And in fact, if you look at the wording in the Bible, Jesus says, I am the Logos. Now we translate that in modern English as I am the Word. You also look in the book of Genesis and it says, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. This doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But then when you take the word Logos, okay, in the beginning there was the Logos, and the Logos was God, and the Logos was with God. So the Law of One actually gives us a cosmic Christianity. It's very interestingly cloaked, but the idea being that the universe itself is the Logos. It's the one infinite creator. But the galaxy is a co-creator. It has its own identity in a sense, but it's still one with God. So the Logos was God, and the Logos was with God. This is God the Father, which is the universe, and God the Son, which is the galaxy. So the galactic Christ is a really important point in the Law of One. Jesus becomes the embodiment of the mind and the will of the galaxy. Okay? How does that iterate into other intelligent life in our galaxy? Well, notice that all of the different insiders we have say that every form of intelligent life in our galaxy is fundamentally human. The Logos created man in its image. God created man in his image, right? That means every part of the creation in our galaxy is the mind and the body of Christ. If you really want to look at it this way. So Jesus is not just an ordinary situation. In fact, one of my insiders, Pete Peterson, visited with a group of like 13 or 14 different races of extraterrestrials in Antarctica. They had a base down there. And this included insectoid races that actually look like a grasshopper or a praying mantis elevated into a bipedal type of form, but it still looks just like an insect. They got the compound eyes, the antenna, mandibles down here, but they can talk and they've become intelligent. And they told him that the reason why they came to the earth was that they were really excited about Jesus, believe it or not. But they said, this correlated perfectly with everything else I was studying, they said, the mind of the galaxy is going to embody in a human on Earth. This doesn't always happen. We're really excited about it happening here, and we came to observe what's going to happen. So those beings would represent angels again, who wanted to see how this plays out. Another important point to note is that both sides of this spiritual war need to tell us what they're going to do before they do it.
Okay, hold on a second. Ein Moment. Okay. So Sir David just said something that was just always incredible to me, was that the mind of the universe was going to incarnate in a physical body on the planet. And I never heard anybody say this ever. David, in the past hour and 45 minutes, gives you some data points and tells a story, an actual story, and it's the most interesting one that's coming up now. This film came out in 2019. I watched this in 2019, and no, I think I watched this, I must have watched this after. I don't know if I watched this film before or after I had a close encounter in December on Christmas Eve, during the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter by PCH at at this lady's house. And there was a silver ship there. It was amazing. The same ship appeared in a Ridley Scott television show for one scene. And the ship appears from the exact same perspective as that which I would see it in December. That is, looking up above a tree line is this silver thing with two white lights. Now, I told this story in January it must have been 2024. In January 2024, I put a YouTube video out to Dark Journalist, who's supposed to be the fucking guy. And I told him about this situation. And I told it in a very circuitous way. I told him in the first 5 minutes I described what it is that I saw, what happened, or what I was going to do. And then I backed it up with a story of, hey, here's some commonality. Here's when I was 17 years old. I wrote this story on, the JFK assassination and what all that entailed. So then I followed that up with actual on-the-ground, just sit and talk with... to finish my 17-year-old Ryan story of who murdered our president and who changed our trajectory. And I never got no response, man. This is my story. I get no response from everybody. But what's really interesting is I'm sitting here, and since that time, this lady... appears that when I tell that story, there's a photograph, a very large IKEA, kind of an iconic IKEA photo. You can buy this in any IKEA. It's large. It goes on the wall, and it's a landscape. And in this case, it's Paris. And in Paris, there's about 7 bridges going across the... It's got to be the... Oh my gosh, I'm going to fail. Is it the Rhine River? Hey Siri, what's the river that goes through Paris? The Seine.
It's Seine.
Seine River. And that's right in the fucking background, man. So that's like... some Twilight language right there. That's speaking about something. I always, it tells you a lot of things about this person. Hey, they fucking shop at IKEA and they like Paris, maybe. And maybe they got something about rivers and bridges, water. And then, so anyway, I tell this story Nobody contacts me, but in a way, Dark Journalist responds I think probably the next show. He talked about this guy. Hey Siri, turn the lights to 100%. He talks about this guy. Look, I'm like the fucking best student this guy has, but he doesn't respond. So that's like kind of weird. What's up with that? So anyway, I try to he tells me that Edgar Cayce learned by sleeping on books. He'd sleep on a book and then he would know the contents of the whole book. I thought maybe I could stack up all my books and make a platform, and I could sleep on the platform, and then maybe I could, via osmosis, know all that stuff. Anyway, what is important, though, is if you're in the library that has all the books that have all the answers, and even if you haven't read that, if your journey requires an answer that's in a book, and you're in the room that has the book, like the movie Interstellar, you can be in this 5-dimensional time and you can see every moment that happens in that room, and every answer is on the shelves there, but it requires it requires a connection. In the world, we send out information and we hope to receive a connection. And a lot of times we're just sending out information. A lot of times information is just flooding us. There's... Anyway, I'm a little sidetracked by that. But what is interesting is the response that I got was that in the Olympics, this same lady appears at the Seine River during the fucking Olympics, singing on the fucking thing. And later in that thing shows up a knight in silver armor on a silver horse walking on the water, and it's just going. And they arranged this so that this scene was going on for it must have been 15 minutes. And it was just, they started up where, and they got a really nice tight shot on it, and then they had these great, just fantastic photography of Paris and all over. And as this rider, strider, water walker comes in, and then it's even got a cape too, of course, I think. Yeah, because you got to have a cape, because Orson Welles once agreed to participate in a film with one condition, and that was to wear a cape. And so you get Orson Welles if you wear a cape, if you let him wear a cape. So this rider shows up, and that was just that was in the summertime, and that was probably 6 months, 5 months after I sent that video. So I can't believe David Wilcock is officially gone. I mean, or we don't even know this. This is a word on the street. I'm hopeful that, there's some type of, espionage game here, some switcheroo, witness protection thing. I don't know. Regardless, what today represents is the end of something that I had, kind of had in my perspective, was that, hey, somewhere down the road I'll run into David and we'll talk, and we're going to talk about all these things that I can't talk to anybody else about. And now I can't do that. That's not a possibility anymore. So I want to remember this incredible thing that he taught me. He just spoke for, this was edited together. David would do these many hour-long Sundays sessions, and they were wonderful. And he interacted with everybody. and he posted people's comments. But I didn't have any money. I could never pay for that. But he even responded to my comments, and he was just so available. But it was irritating because he had to go through all this stuff, all these dumb comments people write, all this. What I really wanted was just, David, tell me you. Just give me you, David, 100%. And this extra scene that is this must be my filmmaker hat on. This is material that is made for the Cosmic Secret, and that's a collection of all different people. All of which is okay, but the person that's got the really golden thread in the whole story is David's. And everybody else is just kind of like, a flipper that attaches to it and helps it move it along a little bit, David is like, top tier information. He delivers so much, and he had this incredible series on Gaia of he had 8 seasons of this thing called Wisdom Teachings. It may have even been 12, where it was just 13 episodes of important stuff nobody else talked to. And you know what? Whatever it was, you could just, this guy did it. This is what he did. He studied all this stuff, and then he just told you about it. He synthesized it, and then he gave it to you as best he could. And then he had this thing, Cosmic Disclosure, with this other guy, and he tells this whole story of, 20 seasons of 10 episodes, again, all this material. And it comes out that, this guy admitted he copyrighted this thing, all these shenanigans, legal, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the day, they go, we're going to just wipe the internet of all that information and just get rid of it. But anyway, if you're, once it's been recorded, and especially once it's been somewhere, if it exists anywhere on any hard drive anywhere, it exists forever. It's a digital signal. If it's recorded, the one that can see all can see it and understands it. And there's a filtering method that happens, is that those who deliver you the gold, they go to the top. And, they don't post every fucking day. The last time I posted to YouTube was in April of last year. And it's now May. It's April of 2026. And I can't... And I'm really sad I haven't digested, the implications of all this. It's a shock, frankly. There's so many things changing, and so many things are being unveiled, and oh gosh, I'm so sorry, David. Thank you for sharing these incredible things, and I want to just share this because this idea you just spoke of literally changed everything. You put it all together, and you told the big story. You told the big story, David. And the people who edited this together did it as such that it's just all you. It's all. It goes from, it has a start, and then it's going to have an end, and there's going to be an incredible amount of information that's told. And I want to thank you for your curiosity and your ability to share with everybody, and to even do your own production. I mean, you had a lot of pride in that, and rightfully so, because I'm somebody who certainly appreciates all the skills it takes to do that. And I'm sorry I didn't comment more things of encouragement, and I'm sorry I had your address and I never mailed you anything. I'm so sorry. Let's hear this incredible thing that nobody else ever said anywhere, anytime, ever. Nobody delivered the goods like this.
We see this all here. Insectoid races. that actually looked like a grasshopper or a praying mantis elevated into a bipedal type of form, but it still looks just like an insect. We've got the compound eyes, the antenna, mandibles down here, but they can talk and they've become intelligent. And they told him that the reason why they came to the earth was that they were really excited about Jesus, believe it or not. But they said, this correlated perfectly with everything else I've studied, they said, the Monday the galaxy is going to embody in a human on earth. This doesn't always happen. We're really excited about it happening here, and we came to observe what's going to happen. So those beings would represent angels again, who wanted to see how this plays out. Another important point to note is that both sides of this spiritual war need to tell us what they're going to do before they do it. We see this all the time with negative agenda. A lot of people talk about this with the Illuminati. They have to tell us how they're enslaving us. They have to give us their symbols in movies. They use the arch all the time. The arch of Baal, the arch of Satan, the arch of Lucifer. Almost every Illuminati movie you see that's disguised as regular Hollywood films, just look for that arch. I mean, it's amazing how much they use it. They used to use the all-seeing eye a lot more, but now people are waking up, so they don't use that one as much. They love the black and white tile floor. That's another example. There's several symbols that they like to use, but the arch is the one that's the most prevalent out of all, because there's so many buildings that have that arch architecture built into it. The positive side also has to tell you what they're going to do. So in the Old Testament, like in the book of Daniel, we see prophecies of Jesus coming. And then people interpret this shining man in the book of Daniel as being Jesus. So I want to point out here that once we look at records from all these other cultures, the prophecy of ascension that Jesus gives us is remarkably consistent. Again, Jesus doesn't talk about the solar flash, but he does say, two shall be walking in the field, and then there shall be one. He also talks about if you are on the top of your house, you're not even going to have time to get down from the roof and go back in the house. If you're out in the field and this event starts to take place, you're not going to have time to run home. You can't bring anything with you. He doesn't say what it is, but from all the other religious reports, we know it's some kind of solar flash. So in the Zoroastrian tradition, which is coming out of Iran or Persia, they talk about frashokareti. They talk about something like molten metal that comes down from the mountains and goes into the lowlands. The Zoroastrians also talk about the idea that the just will go through this just like they're taking a bath in warm milk, but the wicked are burned by it. Another offshoot of the original Indo-Aryan civilization that migrated into Iran and India for milk, but the wicked, the Zoroastrians also talk about the idea that the just will go through this just like they're taking a bath in warm milk, but the wicked are burned by it. Another offshoot of the original Indo-Aryan civilization that migrated into Iran and India is in the Hindu scriptures. And the Hindu scriptures report the same thing, except in their case they call it the Samvardhaka fire or Samvarta fire at the end of the age. They also call it the Yuga fire. And there's well over 150 references to this throughout the Hindu Vedas. They know that it's a flash from the sun. They know that it's blinding white light. They also talk about the fact that it creates rainbow colors in the sky here. Well, we find out that that's because it creates a massive global aurora borealis effect in the sky. We see this thing show up in, again, 35 different ancient cultures. It very commonly is associated with solar flash in these traditions, and it almost always is associated with human evolution, some sort of spontaneous metamorphosis. So isn't it interesting that the same prophecies that Jesus was giving us appear in the Quran, which is the Islamic Bible, quite extensively. It appears in the Old Testament. It appears in Native American spiritual traditions, in Celtic traditions, Druidic traditions. Everybody's got this. So we are now in this war that is predicted in the Bible between good and evil. People think of Satan, they think of a reptilian being in hell, which is underground. There are still Draco reptilians here on Earth in underground bases. And apparently, in some cases, they do abduct people and bring them down there, and you don't want to find out what happens when you get down there. Where we've gone wrong in Christianity, in my opinion, is that the Roman government created this idea of one life to live. And if you are not saved by the church, then you will burn for all eternity in hell. This is another big misunderstanding because Jesus is making a metaphor. The original word that they used for hell was Gehenna. Gehenna, in the original term, was garbage dump on the outside of town, and you would take the dead bodies and burn them out there. Also, the word that they use to mean eternity is eon, or aeon, A-I-O-N. And if you look at other translations from the same time as the Bible, that word simply means a length of time. So burn in hell for all eternity actually refers to the idea of Gehenna, the garbage dump, which is burning off the things in you that are not pure. The idea, like in alchemy, that you have a light body and that there is a crucible living on earth, and that crucible causes all of your impurities to burn off, the pain of living, the pain of being in our society when you're not understood. As that crucible burns off your impurities, you become the light body. As you go through this purification cycle for a period of time, an aeon, right? You are becoming pure. So Jesus actually did teach reincarnation, and that in many cases it takes multiple lifetimes for us to burn off our impurities. The idea being, though, that at the end of the cycle, we have the opportunity to escape reincarnation. We don't have to keep coming back as a human being. We can evolve to the next level. And Jesus also brought in the analogy of the tree with its fruit. The planet Earth is the tree, and most of us will not be able to ascend until the tree itself has ripened, until it reaches the season of the harvest. And at that time, based on the energetics of the Earth, the energetics of our solar system, then there is a solar flash. Then, if you have been properly prepared, you can ascend. So the Cabal, the negative elite, and the Illuminati have reinterpreted the ascension prophecies, and they believe they will be ascending, and the rest of us will be catastrophic event. Whereas, more likely, in fact, I'm quite certain that the teachings are accurate, and they mirror the teachings of many other ancient religions, that it is people who establish principles of goodness, principles of trustworthiness, honor, reliability, patience, forgiveness, compassion, doing the right thing for the greater good of humanity. Those people who step forward as heroes can transform themselves. In fact, I strongly advise if someone who is part of this bloodline Illuminati is watching this movie, that you truly understand that God, or the Creator, or whatever you wish to call it, is a God of forgiveness and salvation. And it is entirely possible for someone to alleviate the karma, even in the case of having participated in these horrible things. This is the whole point of why a sacred figure like Jesus came here. In other words, the best thing that you can do if you are in this Illuminati, the best thing you can do to absolve yourself of karmic debt is to come forward as an insider, as a whistleblower. If you take your life and if you dedicate it in service and you're willing to speak out and you're willing to act on behalf of the greater good of humanity, you better believe that you can get your ticket to the ascension, that you can make a difference by becoming a hero. If you become a hero, if you do the right thing, you do not have to be condemned. You do not have to miss the ascension. So it is very important to remember that these spiritual forces that exist on earth are real, that the different teachers from different religious backgrounds did come in with a message. There is a consistency in this. It is the angelic agenda. It is to teach us the importance of love, forgiveness, compassion, long-suffering, patience, understanding. And once we embrace these principles and we live by these principles, we are bringing ourselves into vibrational accordance with this higher truth. in modern times, and by modern I mean 20th century forward, we have had the good guy, ETs, help humanity build a secret space
Bippity
program.
boppity boop.
They knew that it was being conducted in secret, but the ultimate agenda was for us to have built bases on Earth, bases on the Moon, bases on Mars, that we will inherit as the good guys after we go through the solar flash and ascension process. We already have the infrastructure in place. We will be stepping into that infrastructure as we go through this process, and the negative agenda cannot survive as we go through the solar flash. They can only continue to do these nefarious things up until the point this happens, at which time everything changes. Let's go back real quick to Eisenhower when he was contacted by extraterrestrials, and the original ETs that contacted him were benevolent. And what they said was, if you denuclearize the planet, if you bring about world peace, if you stop all hostilities, we can give you all this technology, and we are getting you ready for this major human evolutionary event. He ended up rejecting their offer. He said, there's no way we can trust you guys enough to get rid of our nukes. And they said, okay, Ike, we're sorry that you didn't take our offer, but bear in mind that after the year 2012, we will be able to show up in mass numbers here on Earth, whether you like it or not. Now, 2012 came and went. Nothing really seems to have happened. It's sad because, for me, looking at the Mayan calendar and looking at the intricacy of the cycles, it was very attractive to look at the date, December 21st, 2012, the end of the Mayan calendar, and expect the solar flash to happen and expect ascension to occur. What the beings that contacted For a Good have actually told us is that we were not ready for this yet. They want as many people as possible to be ready for ascension when this thing happens. So the beings that spoke through For a Good explained that these gigantic spheres were brought into our solar system as a technology to hold off the solar flash until we were sufficiently prepared for it. The time window that we were given, the most recent one, as far as when this might happen, is no later than the year 2029 or 2030, thereabouts. And what we see is that the whole solar system is charging up. The sun is becoming hotter, brighter, and more magnetic. The planets are having enormous changes. They're becoming hotter. Global warming and climate change is not just happening on the Earth, it's happening throughout the entire solar system. It's quite amazing how thorough the data is on this that I have compiled together. And it's important to note that as the whole solar system is heating up, it's because we're building up to this solar flash. We're building up to this emission of energy from the sun. So people often ask me, well, what's going to happen to people who are not ready to ascend? And there's a lot of it, okay? Most of them will be transported to another third-dimensional planet in a quite peaceful way. It's benevolent. It's done with actual ET motherships. And this is all stuff that they do all the time. They move people around, so the people who have gotten what they needed to get from living on Earth or another planet like it, they will be ascending. The people who are confused but not really evil, but haven't gotten to the point that they're ready to graduate, they will be moved to another planet. And the only people who really stick it out here for the catastrophe on Earth are the negatively oriented people. They're the ones that are going to see the tsunamis, they're going to see supervolcanoes going off. Some of them survive in underground bases. They have their own timeline that goes in a totally different direction. When we combine all this information together, what we see is that the ETs that are here now are predominantly benevolent. They would be angelic as we think of them. They are keenly interested in human spiritual evolution. We have a much smaller number of ETs that are evil, that are ruled by the Draco reptilians, and they have, as a slave race, certain insectoid groups as well. They would correspond with the demons that we see in various religious scriptures. Their goal is to try to take over the planet and dominate the planet. It does not appear in any way that they will succeed. It does appear that we are on an ascension timeline, that many more people will understand that by simply following the most basic principles of being a good person, service to others, being loving, being forgiving, taking time to be patient, and learning to love yourself as well as being loving to others. That's also a very important point. Self-forgiveness, self-acceptance. In forgiveness lies the stoppage of the wheel of karma. This is a core law of one quote. By being forgiving, by practicing forgiveness, you discharge the karma that would keep you reincarnated. You learn what you need to know from this earth school. And the graduation is a truly wonderful thing. The Law of One series gives us more information than many other religious prophecies about what to expect when we go through ascension. First of all, they say life in fourth density Earth is 100 times more harmonious than what life is like now. We can't even conceive of that. It is a very exciting future, and it is a future that I am willing to fight for, and that I spend every day of my life getting us ready for. That is the mission, that is the objective, and that is the cosmic secret.
Thank you for spending that bit of time with me here. I wanted to just look at that painting in question there, and sorry, we're just gonna end this on something kind of amazing. I got this thing I do with my Apple iTunes library, which is my most incredible thing I got. So like every Apple TV I got on different TVs, I just go to the library section and I just watch what I want. And I don't have to go through commercials or or any of that other stuff. Excuse me, one sec. And I watch a lot of different movies, so everything's in my catalog, and you know, it picks up from where I left off. And so where I left off earlier, we were talking about Interstellar, the idea that Cooper is in this extra dimensional version of the room where he can communicate with his daughter, and through doing this he can reach her at any point in time, and you know, whatever it happens. And we were kind of talking about that, and that's what I was watching last night. So we'll just watch this cool little scene from Inception, pick it off where I left off. No. All right, ciao.